The city had a way of forgetting people. It did not do so cruelly or deliberately. It simply moved, forward, always forward, on its rivers of yellow headlights and glowing phone screens, on its rivers of coffee and commerce and conversation, and the people it left behind simply fell through the cracks the way water falls through a broken gutter, silently, inevitably, pooling in the dark places where no one thought to look. Arthur Pendleton was one of those people. He was 55 years old, though he looked closer to 70. His face was a landscape of hard weather, a nose broken twice, deep-set eyes the color of old pewter, a jaw thick with gray stubble that had long since stopped being a choice and become simply a fact of survival. He wore a wool-lined army surplus jacket so old that the original olive green had faded to the color of dead grass, and beneath it, 3 layers of mismatched shirts he'd pulled from a donation bin outside St. Margaret's on 4th Avenue. His boots were good, the one luxury he permitted himself, because a man without dry feet in a city winter was a man counting his remaining days. He'd spent 6 weeks collecting aluminum cans to replace them when the last pair finally gave out. He was sitting inside the collapsed lip of a parking structure on Hollis Street, in the part of the downtown district that the city planners called a transitional zone, and that everyone who actually lived there called the gutter. The parking structure had been condemned 3 years ago when a section of the second level cracked through, and since then it had become a kind of informal city within a city. A dozen people at any given time sheltering in its shadowed bays, building small kingdoms out of shopping carts and cardboard and salvaged tarpaulin. Arthur's kingdom was a corner bay at the north end, screened from the wind by a piece of corrugated metal he'd bolted between 2 concrete pillars using hardware he'd found in a dumpster behind a Home Depot. He had a sleeping bag, a camping lantern with 2 batteries left, a duffel bag containing everything he owned, and a plastic bin he'd waterproofed with duct tape that held 3 days' worth of canned food and a can opener. It was not much, but it was organized, and Arthur Pendleton was, above all things, a man who understood the importance of organization. 22 years in the United States Army had wired that into him at a cellular level. The instinct to inventory, to secure the perimeter, to plan for contingencies. The Army had given him those instincts, and then the Army had sent him to places that broke them. 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 in Afghanistan. He had come home with his body mostly intact and his mind in ruins. Post-traumatic stress disorder. That was what the VA doctors called it, in their clean offices with their framed diplomas and their practiced sympathetic expressions. They gave him pills and a pamphlet and a follow-up appointment 2 months out. He had made the appointment. He had even taken the pills, for a while. But the pills made him feel like he was watching his own life from behind thick glass, muffled, distant, slightly unreal. And he had decided that muffled and distant was not the same as healed, and he had stopped taking them. His wife, Sandra, had tried. God, she had tried. For 4 years she had tried, and then she had taken their daughter Emma and moved back to her mother's house in Tennessee. And Arthur did not blame her, not even now, though the absence of them both was a wound that had never once stopped bleeding. That was 7 years ago. He had been sleeping rough for 3. The snow had started around 4 in the afternoon, a fine scattering of flakes that pedestrians cursed lightly and shook from their scarves. By 8 o'clock it had become something else entirely, a full-throated blizzard, the kind that silenced the city block by block as if someone were drawing a vast white curtain across it. Wind screamed between the buildings. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Arthur had retreated behind his corrugated metal screen, zipped himself into his sleeping bag, and was eating the last of a can of chili cold, because lighting the camping stove in this wind was not a battle he felt like fighting tonight, when he heard the sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was barely a sound at all. A low, uneven whimper, thin and exhausted, barely audible beneath the howl of the storm. The kind of sound made by something that has already given up trying to be heard and is simply voicing its pain into the empty air because it does not know what else to do. Arthur sat very still for a moment. He told himself it was the wind. He told himself it was a trick of acoustics in this broken concrete shell. He told himself it was not his problem, but his hands had already begun unzipping the sleeping bag. He found the dog 12 feet away, behind a collapsed grocery cart, half buried under a drift of blowing snow that had piled against the eastern wall. It was a German shepherd, or it had been. At present it looked more like a rumor of a German shepherd, so thin that its ribs were a visible xylophone beneath its matted coat. One ear ragged at the tip as though it had been torn and healed badly. Its left hind leg extended at an angle that suggested old injury rather than new. Its eyes were closed. Its chest rose and fell in small, irregular stutters. Arthur knelt in the snow beside it. He was not an impulsive man. PTSD had robbed him of many things, but it had left him, ironically, with a heightened instinct for threat assessment, for reading a situation before acting. He studied the dog for a long moment, the way a soldier studies unfamiliar terrain before stepping into it. The dog's collar was there, but barely visible under the matted fur. The dog's claws were worn down to the quick. The dog's coat, beneath the grime and the snow, had the particular density of a working dog's double coat, not the coat of a pampered pet. This was a dog that had known work, that had known purpose, that had been, at some point, a serious animal in a serious life. "Hey," Arthur said quietly. The dog's ear, the whole one, twitched. Its eyes did not open. Arthur reached out and laid his bare hand against the dog's ribcage. The fur was ice cold at the surface. Beneath it, the heartbeat was there, faint and fast, like a bird panicking in a closed fist. He made his decision in the way he made all decisions now, without deliberation, without hope or calculation, moved purely by the bone-deep reflex of a man who had spent his life being trained to reach toward those in danger rather than away from them, even when that training had cost him everything. He took off his army jacket. Beneath it, he was wearing 3 shirts and a thermal layer, and he was immediately cold, savagely cold, the wind finding every gap at his neck and wrists. He spread the jacket over the dog, tucking it around the animal's body with the careful deliberateness of someone wrapping a child. Then he scooped the dog up. It weighed almost nothing, maybe 50 pounds where it should have been 80, and carried it back to his corner, into the shelter of the corrugated metal screen. He lit the camping stove. He heated water and mixed it with the remaining broth from the chili can, and when it was lukewarm, he held it in a plastic bowl near the dog's muzzle. For a long time nothing happened. Then the dog's nose twitched. Then its head lifted, millimeter by millimeter, as though even this small movement was an act of supreme effort. Then it drank, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, tongue working against the bowl's edge with a dedication that struck Arthur somewhere in his chest. Half an hour later, the dog was sitting upright. It looked at Arthur. Arthur looked back. The dog's eyes were amber, a deep, serious amber, the color of old whiskey held up to candlelight. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were too present, too measuring, too precise in the way they moved across Arthur's face, reading him the way a person reads a person, looking for the things beneath the surface. There was intelligence there, undeniable and slightly unnerving. There was also, Arthur realized with a small shock, something that looked extraordinarily like gratitude, not the simple, tail-wagging gratitude of a pet, but something older and quieter, a recognition between 2 creatures that had both been through the fire and somehow come out the other side. The dog leaned forward and licked Arthur's hand. Once, slowly, deliberately. Arthur did not move for a long moment. He sat with the dog's warm tongue against his cold skin and felt something shift in the region of his sternum, a sensation so unfamiliar that it took him several seconds to identify it. Not happiness exactly, not hope, something more basic than either, something that felt, simply, like the opposite of alone. "Max," Arthur said, reading the tag on the collar. A simple metal tag, worn to near illegibility, with the name etched in block letters and nothing else. He turned it over in his fingers. The inside of the collar had something else, a small smooth node pressed against the leather's inner face, something he took for a medical tag or a flea treatment chip and did not examine further. "Okay, Max," Arthur said. "You can stay." Max put his head down on Arthur's knee. His tail, thin and matted, moved twice in the slow, emphatic arc of a metronome keeping time against the storm. Outside, the blizzard roared. But in that small corrugated corner of a condemned parking structure, 2 broken things had found each other in the dark, and the cold seemed, very slightly, less cold. 3 days later, the snow stopped and the cold stayed. The gutter thawed incrementally, the way damaged things always do, grudgingly, in stages, leaving ice in all the shadowed places. The street vendors reappeared, stamping their feet behind their carts, breath rising in white plumes. The food cart run by old Jimmy, a 68-year-old Korean-American man who had been selling hot soup and steamed buns from the same spot on Hollis Street for 9 years, was already doing steady business by 7 in the morning. Arthur had come to trust old Jimmy in the way that people on the margins of society develop trust. Slowly, through small consistent acts, through a bowl of soup given on credit, through the deliberate blindness extended toward a man eating standing up at the corner of the cart when all the stools were supposedly taken. Jimmy didn't ask questions. Jimmy didn't look at Arthur the way most people did, with a particular mixture of pity and discomfort that was somehow worse than simple contempt. Max walked beside Arthur on a length of parachute cord that Arthur had tied loosely through the collar ring. Max did not pull at the cord. He walked at Arthur's left side with the measured precision of a dog that had been heel-trained to a standard so high it had become instinct, not obedience, but preference, the natural configuration of a working dog who understood that his place was at his partner's shoulder. People noticed Max. They always did. Despite the matted fur and the visible ribs, there was something in Max's bearing, the level amber gaze, the upright ears, the controlled economy of movement, that communicated former greatness the way an old soldier's posture communicates rank long after the uniform has been put away. They were 2 blocks from Jimmy's cart when they heard Lily. She was sitting on the steps of a closed laundromat, 7 years old, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large and a pair of sneakers with the toes separating from the sole. She was rocking slightly, a small, rhythmic, self-soothing motion, and counting something under her breath, her lips barely moving, her eyes fixed on a crack in the pavement with the intense focus of a child for whom the external world was often overwhelming. Arthur had seen her twice before in the past week. He didn't know her name yet. He knew that she was always alone, always in the same 3-block radius, and always looking at things very carefully. He stopped. Max stopped with him, tilting his nose toward the girl. "You need something?" Arthur asked. His voice was gruff from disuse. He went whole days without speaking to anyone. The girl looked up. Her eyes were very dark, very large. "The crack is 17 centimeters, she said. "I measured it yesterday. Today it's 17.4. "That's so," Arthur said. "Cracks grow," the girl said. "People don't think about that." Arthur stood for a moment, processing this. Max sat down beside him and looked at the girl with the same careful interest he brought to everything. Then, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a dog who understood thresholds, Max lay down on the pavement in front of her, not crowding her, not touching her, simply placing himself in her field of vision at a distance that said, "I am here, and I am not a threat." The girl looked at Max, something in her rocking slowed. "That's Max," Arthur said. "Max," she repeated, testing the sound. Then, "My name is Lily." They walked with her to Jimmy's cart. Jimmy fed all 3 of them, soup for Arthur, a bun for Lily, and a bowl of plain broth with chicken scraps for Max, and did not charge Arthur a cent, simply writing something in his small notebook with the air of a man keeping accounts he intended to settle differently. In the hour they sat at the cart's edge, Arthur learned that Lily had been living in the city's informal network of shelters and charity houses for 4 months, since her grandmother, her last living relative, had died of pneumonia in November. The system had not yet gotten around to formally placing her. He did not know what to do with this information, so he filed it in the same internal register where he kept all the things he did not yet know what to do with. And he watched Max sit beside Lily while she ate, and watched the girl's hand move, very slowly, to rest against the dog's shoulder, and watched Max go perfectly, deliberately still beneath that touch as though he understood that stillness was what she needed. It was at this moment that Derek Vance's patrol car turned onto Hollis Street. The car moved slowly, the way patrol cars in the gutter always moved, not because the officers inside were watching for crime, but because the slow movement was itself a kind of theater, a display of presence designed to remind the people on the street who held the power. Arthur felt the familiar shift in his gut, the old, trained wariness that never fully switched off, and watched the car without appearing to watch it. The car stopped at the far end of the block. Officer Derek Vance got out. He was 35, built like a man who had been athletic in college and had since traded muscle for something harder and less honest. He had a jaw like a spade and eyes the color of dry concrete. Not gray, not blue, simply the color of surfaces that have been walked on for too long. His uniform was immaculate. His boots were steel-toed, polished to a mirror finish. He wore them. Arthur had heard people on the street say, like weapons. He walked to the produce cart 3 down from Jimmy's, a weathered stand run by a Vietnamese man named Pham, who sold oranges and dried goods and, on occasion, bootleg cigarettes to people who couldn't afford the store price. Pham saw Vance coming and his face did something complicated and terrible. It arranged itself into an expression of welcome while his eyes went flat with fear, the way a man's face looks when he has learned that the only safe response to certain kinds of power is a performed smile. Arthur could not hear the conversation from where he sat. He didn't need to. He had seen this performance before, in 3 different countries, in multiple languages. Vance leaned against the cart with the comfortable ease of a man on his own property. He picked up an orange. He put it down. He said something. Pham's hands moved to the zippered pouch below the cart's surface, the one where he kept his daily cash float. He removed something and handed it over in the particular way of someone who has had to do this enough times that the motion has become automatic, something done quickly so it can be done without being thought about. Vance pocketed it. He said something else, something that made Pham nod twice with his eyes on the ground. Then he turned and walked up the block toward Jimmy's cart, and his eyes found Arthur, and then they found Lily, and then they found Max. "Look at this," Vance said, in a tone of voice that was not loud and was not quiet but occupied the particular register of authority performing itself for no audience but itself. He stopped 6 feet away. He looked at Max with the flat, assessing gaze of a man calculating the effort required to destroy something versus the satisfaction it would provide. Vagrant with an unlicensed animal in a public area. You know that's a citation, don't you? Arthur said nothing. He kept his hands visible and his body still. 22 years of navigating dangerous situations had taught him that the 2 worst things you could do when confronted with arbitrary power were to provoke it and to show fear. Lily had gone very still beside him. "I'm talking to you," Vance said. "We were just leaving," Arthur said. Vance took a step forward. And in that moment, Lily with her too large coat and her crack-measuring focus in her world ordered entirely around the predictability of numbers, stood up abruptly to make room and walked directly into Vance's chest. She bounced off him like a bird off glass. She sat down hard on the pavement. Vance looked down at her as though she were a stain on his uniform. "Watch where you're," he started. Arthur was already moving. He stepped between Vance and Lily in a single motion, hands still visible, voice controlled. "She's a child. She didn't see you." What happened next was very fast. Vance's open hand connected with the side of Arthur's face. Not a punch, something worse, a slap delivered with the deliberate contempt of a man who has decided that a closed fist would grant too much dignity to its target. Arthur's head snapped sideways. His ear rang. He tasted copper. He did not fall, and he did not raise his hands, and the effort of those 2 acts of restraint cost him more than he would ever be able to describe. Then Vance stepped around him and kicked Max. The boot caught Max in the abdomen with the full force of a steel-toed strike. The sound it made was a dull, meaty thud that silenced the entire block. Jimmy's hand froze over his soup pot. Pham looked up from 3 carts away. Max flew sideways. He hit the pavement and rolled. Then, and this was the thing that Arthur would think about for a long time afterward, Max got up. He did not whimper. He did not cower. He came to his feet with the controlled, deliberate economy of a trained combat animal, shook himself once, and turned to face Vance. He stood with his legs set evenly, his weight slightly forward, his ears flat against his skull, his tail down and still. A low sound rose from his throat, not a bark, not a howl, something older and more precise than either. A warning that communicated, with unmistakable clarity, "I know exactly what I am capable of. I am choosing, right now, not to do it. Do not misread that choice." Vance stared at the dog. Something moved in his concrete gray eyes. Not quite fear, but the proximate emotion, the recognition of a miscalculation. He had expected the reaction of a kicked animal. He had gotten something else entirely. He laughed, a short, contemptuous sound that Arthur recognized as the laughter of a man covering a moment of uncertainty. "Control your mutt, bum," he said, and turned and walked back to his car. In the aftermath, the block breathed again. Jimmy set down his ladle. Pham went back to arranging his oranges with hands that trembled slightly. Arthur knelt beside Max. running careful hands along the dog's ribs. Max allowed this, standing absolutely still, the warning growl fading to silence. There were no broken ribs that Arthur could feel, but there would be bruising. There had to be bruising. Max turned his amber gaze to Arthur. Then he turned it to the place where Vance's car had stopped, and Arthur saw Max's nose working, cataloging the air in precise, methodical sweeps, the way a cartographer maps terrain. Recording, filing, remembering. On the ground where Vance had stood, something glinted. Arthur picked it up, a lighter. Silver, engraved with a small design, a stylized skull over crossed bones, the kind of thing you'd find in a motorcycle shop or a biker bar. It had the particular engraving of something customized and therefore identifiable. Before Arthur could pocket it, Max put his nose against it, drew a long, slow breath, and lifted his eyes to Arthur with an expression of such deliberate, focused intensity that Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Okay," Arthur said quietly, and put the lighter in his jacket pocket. "Okay, I've got it." Max looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at Lily, who was still sitting on the pavement with her knees drawn up. He walked to her and sat beside her, and very gently pressed the side of his jaw against the top of her head. Lily stopped trembling. Over the following 2 weeks, Max became, without ceremony or negotiation, the center of a small gravity. It happened the way most important things happen, not through declaration, but through accumulation. Max was simply always there, at Arthur's left shoulder when they walked, at Lily's side when she sat with her counting and her measuring, at the entrance of the condemned parking structure when Arthur slept, his amber eyes half open in the dark, monitoring the sounds and smells of the night with the tireless precision of a sentinel who has been on watch so long that wakefulness has become indistinguishable from rest. Arthur noticed things about Max that did not add up to an ordinary dog. The first was the heel. Max walked at Arthur's left with military exactness, outside leg to outside leg, maintaining a spacing that Arthur recognized from a YouTube video someone had once shown him about police K-9 training as the standard operational heel position. Not 6 inches behind, not 6 inches ahead, exactly parallel. Always. Even on crowded sidewalks. Even when a squirrel shot across their path. Even when another dog barked from across the street. And Arthur had seen Max tighten his jaw and keep his eyes forward in those moments. The effort of that restraint visible in the set of his shoulders. A discipline imposed not from fear of correction, but from deep-grained professional habit. The second was the commands. It happened by accident. The third day they were together. Arthur was sorting through a bin of donated items outside the Salvation Army on Clement Street, and he said, without thinking, the word that had surfaced from some half-remembered documentary, "sits." Max sat. Immediately. Precisely. Without hesitation. Arthur looked at him. Max looked back. Arthur said, "Bleep. Stay." A word from the same fragment of memory. Max stayed. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't glance around. He sat with the immovable patience of a statue, eyes on Arthur's face, waiting. "Fuss," Arthur said. "Heel." Max stood and moved to Arthur's left side and matched his pace. German commands. Working dog commands. The commands of a dog trained not for the show ring or the suburb, but for something more serious. For search and rescue. For suspect apprehension. For the precise, dangerous work that required a dog to think independently when the situation demanded and defer to its handler when the situation required something else entirely. Arthur stood in the cold street for a long time, looking at Max with new eyes. He started paying attention to the collar. On the third examination, conducted while Max dozed in the afternoon light, head heavy on Arthur's thigh, he found it. Inside the collar's lining, a small hard node, slightly raised, not organic. Not a flea chip, something more sophisticated. He turned it between his fingers without being able to see it properly, feeling the smooth casing of what he thought might be a tracker, a very small and very well-made tracker, stitched into the lining with the kind of concealed precision that spoke of professional installation rather than aftermarket edition. He put the collar back. He thought about this. He thought about the German commands. He thought about the heel position. He thought about the way Max had assessed Vance in the aftermath of the kick, not with fear, not with pain-driven aggression, but with the cold professional evaluation of an animal that had been trained to make exactly that kind of assessment. He thought about the name on the tag and the tag's worn illegibility, and the way retired military dogs were sometimes retired not through official channels, but through injuries that took them off duty without formally removing them from active registration. He did not know what to do with these thoughts. He knew enough not to walk into any police precinct in the gutter with these questions, because the police in the gutter were not, in Arthur's experience, the kind of people to whom a homeless veteran with no fixed address and a dog of uncertain provenance should bring uncertain information. Meanwhile, Max continued to be extraordinary. The incident with the 3 men from the Holloway Street corner crew happened on a Thursday. They were not serious criminals. They were young, bored, and occasionally dangerous, which was its own category of threat. They had decided, for reasons that Arthur could not fully reconstruct afterward, that Lily's counting games were either funny or irritating, and they had surrounded her in the mouth of the parking structure's entrance and begun the specific kind of low-grade intimidation that stops just short of anything actionable. Arthur had been 50 feet away. He was already turning, already calculating the approach, already preparing for the version of this that he would have to defuse with his body, if not his words. Max was already moving. He did not bark. He did not charge. He walked, quickly, with purpose, directly between the 3 young men and Lily. And then he turned to face them, and he sat down. And the sound that came from his throat was so precisely calibrated in its controlled menace, so perfectly pitched between warning and promise, that the 3 young men took 2 steps backward without, Arthur suspected, fully understanding why. Max held the position until they retreated. Then he turned to Lily and licked her hand once, twice, 3 times. And Lily, who generally did not tolerate being touched without preparation, who needed advance notice and careful negotiation before most forms of physical contact, simply sat and let him do it with an expression of perfect, concentrated peace. Arthur watched this and felt something in his chest do a slow, complicated thing. He had been a soldier once. He had known what it was to be part of a team that trusted you with their lives and expected you to trust them with yours. He had not felt that in 11 years. Max turned and found Arthur's eyes across the 50 feet of cold air between them, and Arthur had the uncanny, slightly vertiginous experience of feeling found. 40 miles across the city, in an office on the 14th floor of police headquarters, Thomas Miller sat at his desk after midnight with the lights off. He had been chief for 8 weeks. He had spent most of those 8 weeks doing 2 things simultaneously: investigating the systematic corruption that had been quietly metastasizing through the 3rd District's Patrol Division for the past 3 years, and searching for his dog. Max had gone missing 14 weeks ago. The circumstances were classified in Miller's personal filing system under "things that keep me awake" rather than any official report, because the circumstances involved a night operation against a narcotics distribution ring, an explosion that had disoriented the entire tactical team, a subsequent scramble in dark and smoke and chaos, and the discovery, 20 minutes later, that Max was not there. No body, no trail, no confirmed signal from the tracking chip, which had either been damaged or was operating at a frequency below the standard monitoring range. They had searched for 3 days. They had found nothing. Miller's colleagues had, carefully and with genuine sympathy, begun using the past tense when they talked about Max. Miller had not. He was looking at a photograph on his phone, Max in full tactical gear, ears forward, amber eyes catching the camera's flash at a crime scene 2 years ago. The photograph had the slightly blurry quality of pictures taken quickly, in the margins of work, by people who were not photographers but who felt the need to document something before it was over. On his desk, spread across a surface that had never once in 8 weeks been fully clear of files, was the preliminary evidence in what Miller was calling Operation Lantern, the slowly accumulating record of Derek Vance's service history, his financial records, his known associates, and, most recently, 3 separate accounts from street-level informants describing extortion payments made to a uniformed officer in the Gutter District. 3 accounts, anonymous, unusable in court as they stood. He needed more. He needed documentation. He needed a witness willing to put their name on a statement. He closed the photograph and looked at the map pinned to the wall. 3rd District, street grid. The zone around Hollis Street and its surrounding blocks glowed faintly in the blue light of his monitor screen. He pressed a button on the tracker application on his desk terminal. The signal strength read, for %, intermittent, damaged, but present. "Where are you, Max?" he said quietly to the empty room. It was Max who found the warehouse. Arthur had not been looking for anything. He had been walking the long circuit he walked most mornings, along the canal path east of Hollis Street, through the edge of the freight yards, down through the stretch of vacant lots and light industrial buildings that occupied the no-man's land between the gutter and the port district, because walking was one of the few reliable treatments he had found for the worst edge of his PTSD. Movement quieted the internal noise. It imposed a rhythm on the disorder in his head. Max walked beside him. And then, at the entrance to the chain-link corridor that ran along the south face of an abandoned textile mill on Crane Street, Max stopped. He had been walking with easy, loping purpose, nose at a moderate working angle, the comfortable posture of a dog engaged in ambient environmental scanning rather than active tracking. Now he was still. His nose was up. His ears were forward, the damaged one trembling slightly with the effort of precise directional focus. His tail had dropped to horizontal, the alert position, neither aggressive nor relaxed. He took 3 steps forward and stopped again. His nose worked in rapid, intense sweeps. His body was absolutely, vibratingly still. Then he looked at Arthur. Arthur had been around Max long enough now to have begun, reluctantly, and with the slight embarrassment of a practical man venturing into territory he associated with sentimentalism, to read these looks. This one was not the look Max gave him when he was checking in, or the look he gave Lily when she was distressed, or the look he gave the aluminum can bins that occasionally contained discarded food. This was a different look entirely. This was the look of a professional arriving at a scene and recognizing what the scene contains. "What is it?" Arthur said quietly. Max turned back toward the chain-link corridor and walked 3 steps into it, then stopped and looked back at Arthur again. In his jacket pocket, Arthur's hand found the silver lighter. He had been carrying it for 2 weeks, turning it over in his fingers when he was uncertain, the way other people handled worry beads. He did not fully understand why he'd kept it. He did not, until this moment, fully understand why Max had reacted to it the way he had. He pulled the lighter out and held it near Max's nose. Max put his nose against it, breathed once, and then pointed his face directly at the building's far end with an expression of calm, total certainty. Arthur looked at the building. He looked at the lighter. He looked at Max. "Okay," he said. "Show me." What they found, at the far end of the chain-link corridor and through a gap in a boarded loading bay that someone had recently and carefully pried open, was not what Arthur had expected. He had expected, perhaps, a flophouse, or a cache of stolen goods of the ordinary kind, electronics, car stereos, the mundane commerce of petty crime. He had not expected to arrive at the interior edge of a large, dark space and look down through a gap in the mezzanine rail to find Derek Vance, in civilian clothes but unmistakable, standing with 4 other men around 4 metal cases laid open on a folding table, conducting a transaction that, by the quantity and packaging of the product visible in those cases, was not petty in any sense of the word. Arthur's phone was in his hand without his being fully aware of putting it there. His hand was shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the adrenaline that had hit his system at about 1,000% over the threshold of his body's ability to process calmly, a response that had gotten him through 2 tours and was now getting him into trouble in a situation where calm was essential. He filmed. The picture was dark and grainy, and the audio was mostly the blood beating in his own ears. But Vance's face was there. The cases were there. 2 of the other men were identifiable by posture and distinctive clothing. It was not nothing. And then Lily sneezed. She had followed them. Arthur had not known this, would not have brought her if he had. Following at the careful, persistent distance of a child who has spent 4 months alone and has therefore attached herself to the 2 beings that feel like safety with an intensity that transcends reason. She had followed them through the chain-link corridor and through the gap in the loading bay and up the exterior staircase to the mezzanine. And she had sneezed at the worst possible moment, the sound small and clear as a bell in the dead silence of the warehouse. Below, every head came up. In the half-second that followed, Arthur experienced the particular clarity of a man for whom danger has always been an organizing principle rather than an exception. He saw the situation as a set of parameters. They were on a mezzanine, the only exit behind them. They had been heard but not yet seen. The men below were moving toward the staircase. He had perhaps 15 seconds. And then Max moved. He went to the far end of the mezzanine, found a stack of old metal shelving units leaning against the wall, and hit them. The crash was enormous. The structural thunder of 200 pounds of metal shelving collapsing onto a concrete floor, the sound rolling through the building like a controlled detonation, impossible to ignore and impossible to accurately locate in a dark, echoing space. It was, Arthur recognized immediately, a perfect diversion. Not a random act of chaos, but a calibrated distraction deployed with the tactical precision of a dog who had been trained for exactly this kind of work. Every head below swung to the far corner. Arthur grabbed Lily's hand and ran. They were back through the loading bay gap and 20 yards down the chain-link corridor before Max caught them up, appearing out of the dark at Arthur's left side with his tongue out and his ears forward, maintaining the heel position even at a dead run. And the sight of it, this battered, brilliant, unbreakable animal running beside him through the dark, hit Arthur somewhere behind his sternum with a force that was half pride and half something he couldn't name. They were 3 blocks away when Arthur risked a look back. He did not see pursuit, but through the gap between buildings, he could see Vance standing at the building's entrance, phone to his ear, staring down the corridor with the still, cold focus of a predator that has just identified a problem it intends to solve. And across 3 blocks in the dark, Vance's eyes found the distinctive shape of a German shepherd moving away into the shadows. A German shepherd with one ear ragged at the tip. Arthur watched Vance's expression change. He knew, then, that they were in serious trouble. The change came over Vance's section of the gutter the way weather fronts move. Invisibly at first, felt before it was seen, a shift in atmospheric pressure that caused the people who lived in those streets to glance over their shoulders more than usual without being able to explain precisely why. Arthur noticed at first in the way people stopped making eye contact with him. Jimmy at his soup cart gave Arthur his bowl in the morning and then moved away with a tightness around his eyes that said, "I am sorry, and I cannot help you, and please don't ask me to." Fam at the produce cart did not look up from his oranges. The network of people who constituted the informal community of the gutter, who were, in their way, as precisely calibrated to the signals of danger as any military intelligence unit, had registered something, and the registered signal was, that man and that dog have become dangerous to know. Vance had put out the word. Arthur didn't know exactly how. He didn't need to. On the second day, he saw the same unmarked car twice on the block, a brown sedan driven by a man he recognized as Sergeant Pete Carlson, one of Vance's known associates in the 3rd District. On the 3rd day, a patrol car made 17 passes down Hollis Street in 14 hours. He counted them, because Arthur Pendleton was a man who counted things under pressure. He tried to call the police. He went to the pay phone on the corner of Clement and 6th, still operational, a relic maintained by some city department that had not yet gotten around to decommissioning it. And he dialed 911 and was connected to dispatch. And when he said he had evidence of criminal activity involving a 3rd District officer and gave his location, there was a pause on the line. And then, "Can you hold, sir?" And he held. And after 3 minutes, a different voice came on the line. A voice he recognized, because he had spent 3 weeks cataloging the voices of the men who worked with Vance, the voice of Pete Carlson. "Who is this?" Carlson said. "Sir, can you state your name and location?" Arthur hung up. He stood with his hand on the cold metal of the phone casing and understood, fully and without residual doubt, that the official channels were closed. He thought very clearly and very quickly in the way that danger had always made him think, stripped of everything unnecessary, down to the essential parameters. What he had, a grainy video, a silver lighter, a dog that had discovered the crime scene. What he needed, to put this information in the hands of someone who was not compromised before Vance could silence him. What stood in the way? He didn't know who was clean in a district where the corruption had been working for 3 years. Max pressed his side against Arthur's leg. Arthur looked down. Max was looking up at him with those amber eyes, ears forward, the posture of a dog waiting for the next command. "I know," Arthur said. "I know. I'm thinking." He thought about what he'd found in the collar. He thought about what he knew about working police dogs, the tracking chips, the registration numbers, the protocols. He thought about the fact that Max had not simply been retired but lost, which meant someone was still looking for him, which meant someone might be monitoring the chip signal. He didn't know if that person was safe. He didn't know if that person existed, but he was running out of options. he made two decisions. First, Lily needed to be somewhere safe before anything else happened. He brought her to St. Margaret's on 4th Avenue, the shelter and soup kitchen where the staff knew him slightly, and where he knew enough about the organization to trust that Vance's reach did not extend into the hands of his Sisters of Mercy. He told the woman at the desk that Lily was alone and needed shelter for the night, and he did not stay to watch them lead her inside, because watching it meant feeling it, and he could not afford that right now. Lily's hand slipped from his at the door. She looked at him with those dark, enormous eyes. "I'll come back," he said. She looked at Max. Max put his nose against her palm, once, gently. "He'll come back too," Arthur said. She went inside. Second, he needed to draw Vance to a specific location rather than wait for Vance to find him in the uncontrolled chaos of the open street. A soldier sets his field of battle when he can. He does not wait to fight on someone else's ground. He knew exactly where to go. The old warehouse district on the eastern edge of the gutter. Condemned buildings, bad lighting, irregular patrols, the kind of terrain where a former soldier and a trained military dog held significant advantages over men who relied on their institutional authority and their backup. It was not, he understood, a plan. It was a direction. Sometimes, in the field, a direction was all you had. They moved through the dark streets as the evening came down and the temperature dropped again, Max at his shoulder, the lighter in his pocket, the phone with the grainy video clasped in his hand with the recording app cued and ready. Behind them, invisible in the dark, a car moved. The snow came back without warning, the way it sometimes does in cities that have been cold long enough. Not building from a gentle start, but arriving fully formed, a wall of white that dropped visibility to 30 feet and muffled the world to a narrow, immediate radius of sound and shadow. Arthur was in the dead-end alley behind the old Crane Street Mill when they found him. It was not the entire dead end he'd meant to use. The route he'd planned had assumed an alternate exit through the mill's east loading dock, and the east loading dock had been sealed since his last visit, with a new length of heavy chain and a padlock that he did not have the time or tools to address. So the alley was, in the end, exactly what its name described: a terminus, a place where forward motion ends and there is only back. Vance came in from the alley's mouth with two of the men from the warehouse, not in uniform now, not making any pretense of official business. One carried a flashlight. The beam swept the alley's length and found Arthur against the far wall, standing with his back to the brick, his phone in his right hand, Max at his left side. Vance walked toward him slowly, the walk of a man who has calculated his outcome and found no remaining variables. "Give me the phone," Vance said. "Give me the dog's collar, and I'll call it an accident. Vagrant assaulted an officer. Dog was put down as a public safety risk. Clean and simple." Arthur said nothing. His heart was doing something very loud. But his hands were steady, the steadiness of a man who has stood in worse places than this and come out the other side, or at least come out, which was all he had ever managed to promise himself. "Last time," Vance said. He reached into his jacket and produced a gun. Max's response was not rage. It was not the explosion of a frightened animal pushed past its breaking point. It was the deployment of a professional, precise, cold, and executed with an economy of motion that made it breathtaking to witness, even in the fractured chaos of a dark alley and a blizzard. He went for the gun hand. Not the leg, not the body, the gun hand. The specific target, the priority objective, the trained focus of an animal that had been taught to disarm rather than to simply attack. He crossed the 6 feet of space between himself and Vance in what seemed like no time at all, a dark shape through the falling snow, arriving at Vance's wrist with the mathematical precision of a calculation that had been running since the moment Vance first laid hands on Arthur 2 weeks ago on Hollis Street. His jaws closed on Vance's right wrist with the full bite force of a dog trained for exactly this purpose. The gun discharged, once, into the alley wall, stone chips flying, and then it left Vance's hand, skating across the snow-covered ground. Vance screamed. He went down to one knee, his free hand going to the knife at his belt, a large folding knife, opened one-handed with the practiced click of a man who had carried it a long time. He drove it into Max's side. Arthur heard the sound of it and felt it in every nerve in his body. Max did not let go. He had been stabbed. He had taken what appeared to be a serious wound in his left flank, and he did not let go. He held on with the terrible, specific grip of a dog that understands that the moment the threat is released, the threat becomes active again. A dog that has weighed the cost of holding against the cost of releasing and made its calculation. Arthur was moving. The two men at Vance's back were moving. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not a clean thing. It was not the kind of thing that translated well to words or to narrative, because combat, real combat, the ugly improvised kind, the kind that happens in dark alleys and blizzards between people who have too much to lose, does not have the grammar of a story. It has the grammar of panic and muscle memory and the particular clarity that comes when the only options are very few and very stark. Arthur fought with everything he had. He fought with the training of 22 years. He fought with the experience of a man who had learned that in a fight with no good options, the only variable you can control is how completely you commit to the bad ones. He put the first man down on the ground and kept him there. The second man hit him from behind, a hard blow to the back of the skull that dropped him to his knees and filled his vision with static. He tasted snow and iron. He got back up. He did not know why, except that he had gotten back up every time since Fallujah, every time since the VA, every time since Sandra's goodbye, and the habit was by now too deeply grooved to override. Vance had freed himself from Max. Max had been forced, finally, by the wound, to break the hold. Vance had shoved him off and stood, his wrist streaming blood, his face gone completely to the face that always was beneath the uniform, a face of pure, unmediated animal rage. He looked for the gun. He found it. He bent toward it. Max, bleeding from his flank, one foreleg trembling, stood between him and it. Just stood there, between the gun and Arthur, bleeding in the snow, trembling with the effort of staying on his feet, not attacking, not retreating, simply occupying the space between the weapon and his partner with the total, unapologetic commitment of a creature for whom the concept of backing away simply did not exist. The amber eyes did not blink. Vance stared at the dog. The dog stared at Vance. The snow fell between them in curtains of white. "Move," Vance said. Max did not move. Vance raised his knife. And then the sirens came. They came from multiple directions simultaneously. Not the single patrol car whoop of a routine approach, but the full, overlapping wail of a coordinated tactical response. Vehicles converging on the alley from three angles. Lights cutting through the snow in blue and white sweeps that turned the alley into a strobing, disorienting theater of shadow and brightness. Vince turned. He looked at the alley entrance, where the lights were brightest. Arthur, from the ground, watched the calculation move across Vance's face, the inventory of remaining options, the mathematics of escape, and watched it conclude. Vance had nowhere to go. The first voice Arthur heard over the sirens was not a dispatcher's voice. It was a voice that spoke with a specific quality of authority, not the performed authority of Derek Vance, the authority that needed an audience to exist, but the real kind, the authority that comes from a person who has been genuinely right more often than they have been wrong and has the scar tissue to prove it. Vance, drop the knife. Get your hands where I can see them. This ends now. Thomas Miller walked into the alley with 3 tactical officers at his back, his badge visible, his weapon drawn and trained with the steadiness of long practice. He was wearing a heavy coat over what appeared to be civilian clothes, the clothing of a man who had gotten the signal at an inconvenient hour and had not wasted time on the niceties of full uniform. Vance stared at him. "Chief, the knife," Miller said. Now. The knife hit the snow. The 2 of Vance's men who were still mobile did not resist. The one Arthur had put on the ground was not in any condition to resist. Vance himself was cuffed with an efficiency that suggested the tactical team had been looking forward to this moment. Miller watched it happen with the expression of a man watching something that has been a long time coming arrive at last. Then he turned, and his eyes moved across the alley, and they found Max Arthur was already kneeling beside the dog. Max had gone down to his side when the siren started, not in panic, but in the deliberate, controlled descent of an animal that has pushed past its reserves and reached the point where the body simply stops. He was lying in a spreading dark stain on the white snow, his eyes open, his chest moving in the shallow, rapid pattern of controlled shock management, his muzzle pointed at Arthur's face. Miller stopped walking. He stopped because he had seen Max, and the seeing of Max had done something to his face that the entire scene behind him, the arrest, the tactical response, the culmination of 8 weeks of investigation, had not. He stood absolutely still for 2 full seconds, and those 2 seconds contained something that Arthur, despite everything, recognized as the specific paralysis of a person confronting the return of something they had not quite stopped grieving. Then Miller walked forward and knelt in the snow beside Max. "Max," he said. His voice was completely different. "Hey, buddy. Hey, I've got you. I've got you now." Max's tail moved in the snow. Once, a slow, deliberate sweep that pushed aside a thin layer of white and left a dark trace against the frozen ground. Miller put his hand against Max's neck. He kept it there. He did not look up for a long moment. When he did, he looked at Arthur, taking in the split lip, the blood on his forehead, the military bearing that no number of years on the street had fully erased. "You're Arthur Pendleton," Miller said. "Not a question. Retired Army. I've been reading about you for the last 6 hours." Arthur blinked. 6 hours. The chip in Max's collar has been intermittent. I've been monitoring its signal for months. Tonight it went to full strength. Someone must have activated it. Or maybe Max. Miller shook his head. "I don't fully understand it. The tech department will have a theory. I just know I followed it here." He looked down at Max. "You kept him alive." "He kept me alive," Arthur said. "There's a difference." Arthur reached into his jacket and handed Miller his phone, and then the silver lighter. "This should help. The lighter is Vance's. I can tell you exactly where it was dropped and when. The video is dark, but you can see his face. And I have 2 weeks of other observations. Times, locations, transaction descriptions. I've been writing it down." Miller took the phone. He took the lighter. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has been building a case in the dark and has just been handed the last piece. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, "I'm going to need you to make a formal statement. Tonight, at a location that is not anywhere near the 3rd District." "I know the drill," Arthur said. The ambulance came for Max 12 minutes later. Arthur rode with it, his hand on Max's flank through the entire drive, and the contact seemed to matter. Max's breathing steadied slightly, the distress in his eyes smoothing to something closer to the quiet amber focus that Arthur had come to think of as Max's true resting expression. In the emergency veterinary suite, a young vet named Dr. Rebecca Chow, who had been roused at midnight and had arrived in a coat over her pajamas, assessed the wound with hands that were unhurried and precise. The knife had missed the major vessels. The bleeding was serious, but not critical. Max would need surgery, several hours of it, and several weeks of recovery. "He's got a remarkable constitution," Dr. Chow said. She was looking at Max's medical history, which Miller had provided from police department records. "For his age and everything he's been through," she paused, "this dog should be angrier at the world." "He's not built that way," Miller said from the waiting area doorway. The surgery took 4 hours. Arthur sat in the waiting room with his hands clasped between his knees, his head slightly bowed, doing the thing he had not done in a very long time. Waiting without planning, simply present in the moment, tethered to the outcome of something he could not control. At 6 in the morning, Dr. Chow came out with her surgical mask around her neck and her eyes red from the long night. She looked at Arthur. "He made it," she said. "He wants to see you." She said this with complete matter-of-factness, as though it were simply the accurate description of observed behavior, and Arthur did not question it, because he found that it was precisely and exactly the accurate description of what Max did when Arthur came through the recovery room door, lifted his head, located Arthur's face, and let out a long, slow exhalation that was not quite a sigh and not quite a sound, more like the release of something held under great pressure for a very long time. Arthur sat on the floor beside the recovery table and put his forehead against Max's and stayed there for a while. Meanwhile, across the city, Derek Vance was processed, charged, and placed in a holding cell in the central precinct with a set of charges that Detective Sergeant Harris, one of 3 investigators Miller had spent 2 months quietly cultivating within the department as clean assets, described as comprehensive: extortion, bribery, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, assault of a civilian, aggravated animal cruelty, obstruction of justice, and, pending the full forensic analysis of the Crane Street warehouse and its contents, potentially 3 more counts that would, the DA's office later confirmed, result in a sentence measured in decades rather than years. Pete Carlson, Vance's partner, turned state's evidence within 48 hours in exchange for a reduced charge. His testimony, combined with Arthur's statement and the recovered video, built a case of the kind that leaves very little for defense attorneys to work with. The 3rd District's Internal Affairs Division was, in Miller's own understated language, restructured. 5 officers resigned. 2 were arrested. A new oversight board was installed, and its first public statement cited the case as the impetus for district-wide reforms. None of this was rapid. None of it was clean. Justice, as Arthur had learned in his life, is rarely either of those things. But it was real, and it moved forward, which was all that could be asked. And in a recovery room in the East Side Emergency Veterinary Center, Max slept. Spring arrived in the city the way it always does after a particularly brutal winter. Suddenly, improbably, as though the season had been delayed by paperwork and had now shown up all at once to make up for lost time. The trees in the small park on Clement Street, which Arthur had walked past every day for 3 years without ever particularly noticing them, erupted in pale green in what seemed like a matter of days, the buds going to leaves with an urgency that felt, if you were paying attention, like a kind of insistence. Arthur was paying attention now. He had a key in his pocket. An actual key, a brass and plastic fob with the logo of the Metropolitan Police Department's K-9 and Animal Services Division for the small house adjacent to the main K-9 training facility on the department's eastern campus. The house was not large. It had a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a small office, and a yard, a proper yard, with a wooden fence and grass that was, right now, damp and slightly patchy, but unambiguously grass, which was the kind of thing that strikes you with tremendous force when you have slept on concrete for 3 years. He had started work 3 weeks ago. His title was K-9 Unit Housing Coordinator, which was a recently created position that Miller had, with the particular creativity of an administrator who has decided that the right outcome is worth inventing new categories for, defined as encompassing the care, housing, and welfare management of retired and active service dogs assigned to the Metropolitan Department. The work involved feeding schedules, veterinary coordination, facility maintenance, and the kind of close daily contact with a rotating cast of German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and one extremely opinionated Labrador Retriever that Arthur had discovered, to his own quiet astonishment, he was very good at. He was good at it because he understood dogs who had done serious work and then been asked to live in the world without it. He understood the hypervigilance, the restlessness, the way sudden sounds could translate into postures of alarm that required time and patience and consistent presence to walk back from. He understood these things not from any formal training, but from the inside. He had begun to think, exactly the right person for this job. Lily was in the yard. She was 7 years and 4 months old, and she had been officially in Arthur's care for 5 weeks, placed through an emergency fostering arrangement that the social worker who managed her case, a tired but fundamentally decent woman named Ms. Okafor, had characterized as irregular but defensible given the circumstances. The adoption process was slower, as adoption processes always are, moving through its channels at the pace of institutional caution. Lily had strong feelings about this pace. She tracked the process on a handmade calendar on her bedroom wall, marking each day with a small blue dot. There were 37 blue dots. She was in the yard with a measuring tape, very carefully documenting the dimensions of a crack in the patio stones. "It's 2.2 centimeters, she announced to Max, who was lying on his side in the sun near the fence, his eyes half closed in the particular expression of profound physical well-being that belongs exclusively to dogs who have found a warm spot and have no pressing obligations. His surgical scar was visible along his left flank where the fur had grown back in a slightly different texture, a seam in the landscape of him, evidence of a night that had altered more than the body it marked. His tail moved twice at the sound of Lily's voice. 2.2 centimeters, Arthur confirmed from the doorstep, where he was drinking the first coffee of the morning from a mug that said Metropolitan PD and had been given to him by Harris from the investigations team, who had the slightly awkward generosity of a man who did not know how to properly acknowledge being in someone's debt. "It'll probably be 2.4 by next week," Lily said with the satisfied tone of someone whose data matches their hypothesis. "Probably," Arthur agreed. Max turned his head and looked at Arthur. The amber eyes were clear and present, the damaged ear tilted slightly toward him in the posture of a dog who is both resting and listening, both at ease and prepared. the specific quality of attention that Max brought to everything, the refusal to be entirely off-duty, the habit of a life spent being needed. Arthur sat down on the step and held out his hand, palm up. Max got up with the slightly deliberate care of an 8-year-old dog with a recent surgical site, crossed the yard, and put his chin in Arthur's palm. They stayed like that for a while, the man and the dog in the morning sun, with the child measuring the earth and the coffee going cool and the spring light doing complicated things in the new leaves overhead. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of moment that makes for good storytelling. No conflict, no stakes, no narrative arc. It was simply the accumulated weight of two broken things that had found their way back to something like wholeness, and the wordless, uncomplicated gratitude that comes with it. Thomas Miller came through the yard gate at 9. He did this occasionally, stopped in before or after his morning run, in the quiet hours before the weight of the chief's office came back down. He said it was to check on Max. Arthur suspected it was also because this yard, with its patchy grass and its crack-measuring child, and its retired sergeant of a dog, had become a place that Miller needed the way certain people need a specific kind of quiet. He crouched down beside Max and ran his hand along the dog's neck with the practiced, absent tenderness of long familiarity. "How's he moving?" Miller asked. "Better every day," Arthur said. "The vet says the scar tissue is settling in well. He'll have a slight stiffness in the left hind permanently, she thinks. But it won't bother him." Miller nodded. He looked at Max for a moment in silence. "I've been asked," Miller said, "by the department's communications office, to write something. About the case. About Max." He paused. "About you." "I don't need a story written about me," Arthur said. "It's not about you specifically," Miller said. "It's about the concept. The idea that," he stopped. "Tried again. The idea that an animal can be more faithful to justice than the people who are sworn to uphold it. That there's something in a dog like Max that can't be corrupted, can't be bought or threatened or talked out of what it knows is right." He was quiet for a moment. "I can't quite find the words for it." Arthur looked at Max, at the dog lying in the spring sun with his chin on Arthur's knee and his eyes at half-mast, breathing slowly and evenly in the rhythm of an animal entirely at peace in this particular moment of this particular morning. "Max is the same dog he was when you lost him," Arthur said. "Whatever happened to him in between, whatever I put him through at the end, he's still exactly what he was. That doesn't change." He paused. "I don't know what you call that." Miller was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think you call it character." Lily looked up from her measuring tape. "Max," she said. Max's tail moved. "I measured the crack," she told him with the gravity of a scientist delivering findings. Max tilted his head 3 degrees to the left, the precise angle of a dog giving a report its full evaluative attention. Lily smiled. It was a small smile, and it took its time appearing, and when it was there it transformed her face entirely, not into something different from her usual face, but into the fullness of it, all of it present at once, the intelligence and the carefulness and the enormous quiet love that she directed at the world's precise and measurable details. Arthur watched it happen and felt the wound in his chest that had been bleeding for 11 years. The absence of Emma, of Sandra, of the man he'd been before the war took him apart. Do something it had not done in all that time. It did not close. Wounds like that do not close entirely, and perhaps they are not meant to. But it went still. The bleeding stopped, or seemed to stop, or stopped enough that he could breathe around it without flinching. Max turned his head and looked at Arthur with those amber eyes. Arthur looked back. In the light of that spring morning, with the coffee cooling in his hand and the child measuring the earth and the city moving beyond a fence in its unceasing forward river, Arthur Pendleton, retired soldier, broken man, 55 years old, and starting over in a house with a yard and a key, felt something he had not felt since he was 23 years old and standing at the gate of the base before his first deployment, full of purpose and forward motion and the particular invincibility of a person who does not yet know what the world costs. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The dog put his head back down on Arthur's knee and closed his eyes. In the weeks and months that followed, the Metropolitan Police Department's K-9 unit underwent what Chief Thomas Miller publicly described as a fundamental reassessment of how we value our working animals and the people who care for them. New welfare protocols were implemented. Retirement procedures were revised. The position of K-9 housing coordinator was formalized and expanded to 3 full-time roles. Derek Vance was convicted on 11 counts and sentenced to 23 years in the state penitentiary. His accomplice Carlson served 4 years under a plea arrangement and was subsequently dismissed from the department. Lily's adoption was finalized on a Tuesday afternoon in July. She wore her best dress and brought with her a handmade card for the judge that contained, among other things, a measured diagram of the crack in the yard patio, now 2.8 centimeters, which she presented as evidence of the passage of time and the constancy of her address. The judge, who had been on the family court bench for 22 years and prided himself on having seen everything, kept the card. Max's scar faded over the summer to a thin silver line, visible only when the light hit his coat at a certain angle. He continued to walk at Arthur's left side. Always the left side, always at heel, always with one amber eye half on the world and the other on his partner. He continued to put his chin in Arthur's palm in the mornings, and to tilt his head 3 degrees left when Lily was reporting something important, and to sleep in the patch of sun by the fence on warm afternoons with the particular, complete, unguarded abandon of an animal that has finally, irrevocably, come home. And on cold nights when the wind came up and the city's lights blurred through the window glass, Arthur sometimes sat with Max's weight against his side and thought about the things that survive the worst a world can do, not untouched, not unchanged, but alive, still present, still reaching toward the light with everything they have. He thought about a night in a blizzard in a bag of bones behind a grocery cart and the warm weight of a tongue on a cold hand. He thought, some things cannot be taken from you. Some loyalties run deeper than circumstance, deeper than injury, deeper than everything the world can pile on top of them. The dog breathed steadily beside him in the dark, and Arthur slept without dreaming,